Three men followed the exact same philosophy. All three failed. Badly. And somehow, none of them handled it the same way. One buried his failure inside a journal only he was ever allowed to read. One met his failure with a strange theatrical calm, and one didn't even flinch, because by the time failure arrived, it had already stopped meaning anything to him at all. They read the same texts. They believed the same core idea. So why did failure break each of them open in a completely different direction? Here's what makes this strange. Stoicism is supposed to be one philosophy, one method for staying steady when life goes wrong. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus all built their thinking around the same principle. Some things are in your control, and some things are not. But when their own failures actually arrived, real ones, career-ending, life-threatening ones, they didn't reach for the same response. One turned inward and quietly corrected himself in private. One performed composure until his very last breath. One had already decided years earlier that failure could never touch him at all. If you've ever failed at something and noticed that some days you spiral, some days you go numb, and some days you just quietly fix it and move on, you're not being inconsistent. You're doing exactly what they did. By the end of this video, you'll know which kind of failure response is actually yours, and why the difference has nothing to do with willpower. Start with the most powerful man in the Roman world. Marcus Aurelius inherited an empire in the middle of a war he didn't choose, a plague that killed a large share of his own soldiers, and a co-emperor whose temperament and habits were almost nothing like his own. He spent most of his reign at war on the northern frontier, sleeping in military tents instead of a palace. And by his own account, he still felt like he was failing. Meditations, the private journal he never intended anyone else to read, is full of a man correcting himself, not congratulating himself, correcting. He writes to himself the way a coach writes to a struggling athlete, patient, repetitive, unimpressed by excuses. His failure response wasn't dramatic. There's no scene of Marcus collapsing in despair, no grand confession to the Senate. He simply opened a notebook at the end of a hard day and asked himself quietly where he'd gone wrong and what he'd do differently tomorrow. If you've ever failed at something and immediately opened your notes app to figure out what happened instead of telling anyone, that's Marcus Aurelius's move. Quiet, private, corrective. Failure treated as information, not as identity. Now take Seneca, and here, failure looks completely different. Seneca's failure wasn't a battle. It was political. Accused of an affair with the emperor's niece, he was exiled to Corsica for 8 years, stripped of status and cut off from Roman life entirely. Years later, brought back and made an advisor to a young emperor named Nero, he found himself defending the indefensible, including, historians note, helping justify Nero's decision to have his own mother killed. Seneca wrote beautifully about simplicity and restraint. He also lived in extraordinary wealth, and more than one Roman senator pointed out the contradiction to his face. So when his failure finally caught up with him, when Nero turned on his old advisor and ordered him to end his own life, Seneca didn't panic, and he didn't apologize. According to the historian Tacitus, he calmly called for his will, comforted his weeping friends, and gave his own physician instructions on how to open his veins. He kept discussing philosophy, almost until his final breath. It's worth noting, the man famous for warning everyone about the dangers of luxury reportedly sat on a fortune of some 300 million sesterces and multiple country estates, wealth so conspicuous that his fellow Romans openly mocked him for it. Even the Stoics had blind spots. Seneca's failure response wasn't correction. It was composure, performed, deliberate, almost theatrical. Whether that calm was fully earned or partly rehearsed is something historians still argue about. But faced with the one failure he couldn't undo, he chose to control exactly how it looked from the outside. Then there's Epictetus, and his story removes the choice entirely. Epictetus wasn't born into failure. He was born into it permanently. A slave in Rome, on ancient account, says his own master twisted his leg badly enough to break it, and that Epictetus calmly warned him it would break, as if stating a fact rather than a threat. Other ancient sources instead say he was simply lame from illness since childhood. Historians still aren't certain which story is true. He owned nothing. He controlled nothing. Every external marker of success or failure that mattered so much to Marcus or Seneca simply didn't apply to him. So Epictetus built his entire philosophy around one move: separate what happens to you from what you decide it means. A crippled leg is a fact about your leg. It is not a fact about your character, unless you hand it that power yourself. When failure came for Epictetus, there was no journal entry and there was no performance. There was nothing left to perform. Because by the time real hardship reached him, he had already decided, years earlier, that it could never reach the part of him that mattered. If Marcus corrected himself and Seneca performed calm, Epictetus simply refused to hand failure the authority to define him, before it ever even arrived. Picture Marcus at his writing desk in a cold military tent, correcting himself by candlelight after a defeat. And picture yourself tonight, replaying a mistake at work in your head before you fall asleep. Same movement, 18 centuries apart. Picture Seneca, calm and composed, giving quiet instructions to his own physician in his final hour. And picture yourself forcing a steady voice through a phone call you didn't want to make, holding it together because someone is watching. Same performance, same reason. Picture Epictetus, a disabled former slave, refusing to let his circumstances define his worth. And picture yourself, after a rejection or a failure that wasn't your fault, quietly trying to separate what happened from what it says about you. 3 different centuries, 3 completely different situations. The same underlying question, asked 3 different ways. What does this failure actually get to mean about me? Here's the part almost nobody notices. These 3 men weren't disagreeing with each other. They were responding correctly to 3 completely different amounts of control. Marcus had enormous control over an empire, over policy, over his own choices. So his failure response was correction. Fix what's actually fixable. Seneca had control over almost nothing by the very end. His life was no longer his to save. So his failure response was composure. Control the one thing that was left, which was how he faced it. Epictetus had never had control over his circumstances, not for a single day of his life. So his failure response was reframing. Refused to let something he never controlled define something he did control, which was his own judgment. The 3 reactions look contradictory. They're not. They're the same principle. Some things are in your control, some are not. Applied honestly to 3 completely different situations. The mistake most people make with failure isn't choosing the wrong response. It's using the same response for every situation, whether or not it actually fits. So the next time you fail at something, the real question isn't, how do I stay calm? It's, how much of this is actually mine to fix, correct, what you can, like Marcus. Compose yourself where you can't, like Seneca, and release what was never yours to control in the first place, like Epictetus. But there's a complication none of the three of them ever fully solved. Seneca spent his whole life teaching restraint, while living in more luxury than almost anyone in Rome. And that contradiction didn't just sit quietly in the background. It nearly cost him his reputation long before it ever cost him his life. That's a very different kind of failure. And it's next.